And what are they thinking? And why are they thinking it? Now, if you do dream analysis, and this is a tricky thing, because who's to say if your damn analysis is correct, right? It's very difficult to understand that. If you do dream analysis with someone, you generally have them lay out their dream. And then you ask them when they're going through their dream a second time, they lay out their dream and you can kind of get a picture of it. And then they lay out their dream a second time, and as they go through it, every time they mention a detail or a character, you ask them what that reminds them of. And the hypothesis is that the dream is presenting an image or an idea that's associated with a network of ideas, and that if you can expand on the network of ideas as you go through the dream, you can elaborate on the dream, you can expand it upwards, and you can start to see what it might be attempting to put forward. Now, Freud's idea was that the dream knew what it was doing, but that its content was being suppressed and oppressed by an internal censor. So the dream had to be sneaky about what it was saying because it was going to deliver a message that the person didn't want to hear. And that was tied up with his idea of repression. But that's not Jung's idea. See, Jung's idea was different. He said, no, the dream is trying to tell you what it's trying to tell you as clear as it can. That's just the best it can do. And so you could think of the dream, and this is, I believe, the right way to think about it. The dream is the birthplace of thought, the same way that artists are the birthplace of culture. It's exactly the same process. It's that your mind is groping outward to try to comprehend what it has not yet comprehended. And it does that first by trying to map it onto image. And it's doing that in the dream, and it's somewhat incoherent. And well, let's stick with incoherent, because it's not yet a full-fledged thought. It's the birthplace of thought. It's a fantasy about what might be. And then if you can grip the fantasy and share it with other people, then maybe they can elaborate upon it and bring it into being with more clarity than it would be if it merely existed as the precursor of a thought in your imagination. Now, because Jung's idea too was, okay, you think in words. Where the hell do those thoughts come from? Well, they just spring into my head. Well, that's not much of an answer. They just, pop out of the void? Is there some sort of precursor to the development of the ideas? Is there a developmental pathway? So here's an image. This is the Buddha. There's calm water. There's a lotus. The roots go all the way down to the bottom of the lake. It's dark down there. The roots are embedded in the dark substrata at the bottom of the lake. The plant moves upwards towards the light. The water gets lighter and lighter as you move upward with the root. The flower manifests itself on the surface, and the Buddha sits in the middle. That's an image about how ideas develop. They come out from the bottom of reality, and they push themselves up towards the light, and they blast forward, and something emerges as a consequence. That's what that image means. And it's an image. The gold Buddha that's sitting in the middle of the lotus is an image of the perfect person. You could think about the gold Buddha who sits in a triangle as exactly the same thing that's the eye on the top of the pyramid. These are all the same ideas. And what's the idea that's trying to burst forward? How to be in the world. Well, what other idea would burst forward? Because it's the only problem that you really have. Right? How should you manifest yourself properly in the world? It's everyone's question. It's the ultimate question. It's been the ultimate question since the beginning of time. And we've been working out that idea forever. First of all, merely by acting it out, and then by representing the actions, and then by representing the representations, and spiraling all that together. So I started looking developmentally. I thought, okay, maybe these ideas have roots, and this was partly predicated on the observation from Dostoevsky and Nietzsche and so forth, that there did seem to be a necessary pattern in morality. There seemed to be a necessary pattern. And it wasn't arbitrary. It was a representation of the specific mode of human being. And it isn't something that's just imposed on you by your culture. It's not something that's just learned. It's intrinsic in you, and it's manifest in the culture at the same time. And there's a there's a dialogue between those two things, culture and nature, where the idea is embedded, trying to make the proper articulation of that spring forward in each individual. And that's only to say these aren't radical propositions. Your nature strives so that you can manifest yourself properly in the world. Culture strives to aid you in that endeavor. Is Is there something about that that's of dubious validity? What else would it be doing? Working for your death? Hardly. Working for your destruction? Well, you could see that maybe when culture becomes pathologized, but to the degree that it's able to maintain itself across long periods of time, it obviously has to be striving in some way for your individual manifestation so that you can survive and flourish. So there's a co-creation of the human being going on through nature and through culture, and then perhaps with your own voluntary will participating, whatever the hell that is, something we don't understand at all and are prone to dismiss because of that. So then I learned about Piaget, and Piaget had some very interesting ideas, and I think I've told you already what Piaget was up to. He wasn't a developmental psychologist. He didn't even regard himself as a psychologist. He wanted to reconcile science and religion. That's what he was doing through his entire bloody life, because it drove him crazy when he was an adolescent. And he didn't think that he would be able to survive unless he could bring those two things together. So he's working on the same problem. And so one of the things that Piaget, who was very prone to observation, he was an ethologist of human beings. That's a good way of thinking about it. An ethologist is a scientist who studies animals by watching their behavior rather than studying them under laboratory conditions. And he got very interested in the spontaneous emergence of morality in the play of children. And it was so smart, that idea that, when kids come together and unify themselves towards a particular goal, so in play, that a morality emerges out of that. And that morality, and I've mentioned this before, there's a morality in game 1, there's a morality in game 2, there's a morality in game 3. What's common across all those moralities is a meta-morality. And so the meta-morality emerges from the particular moralities that are embedded in particular cooperative situations. We could say cooperative and competitive situations. You can expand that out biologically to some degree to the idea of the dominance hierarchy, right? Every social animal, and even many animals who aren't social, are embedded in a dominance hierarchy. The dominance hierarchy has a structure, or we couldn't call it a dominance hierarchy. Dominance hierarchy A, B, C, D, E, thousands of them across thousands of years. You extract out from all of them what's central to all of them. That's the pyramid of value. What question do you need answered about the pyramid of value? What's at the top? Because that's the ideal. That's the eye at the top of the pyramid, or the golden Buddha in the lotus. It's the same thing. It's the same thing as the crucifix, paradoxically enough. And that has to do with something like the voluntary acceptance and therefore transcendence of suffering. It's something like that. These are not arbitrary ideas. They're deeply, that's my case anyways, they're deeply, deeply, deeply rooted in biology and culture. They're as deeply rooted in biology as the dominance hierarchy is rooted in biology. And we already know the answer to that. The dominance hierarchy has been around for 350 million years. It's a long time. You don't get to just brush that off and say, well, morality is some sort of second order cognitive problem. It's like, no, it's not. I mean, I can tell you something about its instantiation in your nervous system. You have a counter at the bottom of your brain that keeps track of where you are in terms of your status. And it bloody well regulates the sensitivity of your emotions. So if you're at the bottom of the hierarchy, barely clinging on to the world, everything overwhelms you. And that's because you're damn near dead. And so everything should overwhelm you. You've got no extra resources. Any more threat, you're sunk. So you become extremely sensitive to negative emotion and maybe also impulsive, so that you grab while the grabbing's good. And if you're nearer the top in the dominance hierarchy and your counter tells you that, then your serotonin levels go up, you're less sensitive to negative emotion, you're less impulsive, you live longer, like everything works in your favor. Your immune system functions better, and you're oriented at least to some degree towards the medium and long-term future. And you can afford that because all hell isn't breaking loose around you all the time. And so then the question is there a way of being that increases the probability that you're going to move up dominance hierarchies? Well, that doesn't seem to be a particularly provocative proposition, unless you think that it's completely arbitrary and random, and that you can think that if you want, but I don't think there's any evidence for that whatsoever. I mean, we certainly have even for sexual selection, we impose criteria. They're not random and arbitrary. So, okay, so back to Jung. So what was Jung trying to do? Well, he was trying to see, Jung believed that once we had stopped populating the cosmos with gods, that they went inside. That's a good way of thinking. Well, think about it this way. You know, an archaic person looks at the sky and uses his imagination to populate the sky. What's the sky? Well, it's the constellations. It's the domain of the gods. Well, why? Well, because the gods are what are out there beyond your understanding. Well, that's what you see when you look up at the sky. So you populate the night sky with figures of your imagination. So the gods are the things that you broadcast out of your imagination and see spread over the world. It's like the contents of your unconscious are manifesting themselves when you encounter the unknown. It's exactly what it is. That's exactly how else could it be, right? You're projecting your fantasy onto what you don't understand. That's how you start to cope with what you don't understand. You populate the unknown with deities. Where did they come from? They came from your imagination. Well, what happens when you take them out of the world? Do they disappear? No. They just go back into your imagination. So that's where Jung dug down to find them. That's the same motif as rescuing your dead father or rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. It's the same idea, is that the corpses of the gods inhabit your imagination. So where do you go if you need to revivify them? You go into your imagination. And that's exactly what Jung did. And I mean, this is no secret. If you read Jung, he tells you that's what he did. He tells you that's why he did it. It's not an interpretation on my part. Well, so then the question is, what's down there? Is it just mess and catastrophe? Or is there something in it that's patterned? Well, Jung's proposition was that you rediscover the great archetypes that guide human being by investigating the structure of your imagination. When he thought about the imagination, in some sense, at least in part, as a manifestation of your biology. Well, yes. What else would it be? You know, and I told you that story about my nephew, I believe, right? About him running around as a knight and then going off to have a combat with the dwarves and the dragons. It's like, well, where did that come from? Well, partly it came from his culture, right? Because he was a knight, and so obviously that's a cultural construct. But the thing is that his imagination it's this structure that's looking for things to fill itself with, just like your predisposition to language. You have a predisposition to language. What is that? We don't know. What does it do? It looks for things in the world to fill itself with, right? And if you first of all, when you start to learn how to speak, you babble every phoneme. Did you know that? If I was learning to speak an Asian language, there would be phonemes I couldn't pronounce, and vice versa. An infant, all of them, they babble all the phonemes, and then as they start to learn the language, they lose the ability to say a bunch of them and only retain the ones that are relevant to that language. So a baby babbles all possible languages, that's a way of thinking about it, and then loses the ability. So that's you can see there. So you could say, well, you manifest the potential to be possessed by the set of all possible archetypes. It's built into your biology. And then as you're enculturated in your own culture, the set of archetypes that manifest themselves in that culture are the ones that you pull in for your own use. So my nephew's running around like a knight. Well, you know, if he would have been born in the middle of the Amazon, he would have been running around with a bow and, you know, a poisoned arrow and a bow. It's the same thing. It's the same idea. It's just trapped out in different cultural dress. And his little imagination was trying to solve the problem. How do you deal with the unknown? Well, what's the unknown? It's these little devils that keep jumping up on you and biting you, and they come out without end. So just killing them, it's like cutting the head off the Hydra, right? 7 more grow. Well, what the hell good is it to solve one problem when there's just a bunch more problems that are going to come after you? And that's everyone's question. That's the ultimate question of nihilism, right? Why bother solving a problem if all that's going to happen is that 20 more problems are going to come your way? Why not just give up and die? Well, right, it's a good question. It's a good question, right? Is the suffering so intense that the whole game should just be brought to an end?